The silent Vistio-War-Weetha War ended on a Tuesday. Admiral Levorth stood on the command deck of the Xantharian flagship Eternal Radiance, watching the last Scriven vessel disintegrate into particles of frozen matter. Around him, his crew celebrated with the peculiar humming sound that Xanthari made when experiencing joy. Their crystalline bodies vibrated at frequencies that created harmonious tones throughout the ship. Victory had come swiftly and decisively. The Scriven horde, which had terrorized the outer colonies for 3 years, was finally broken. Vorath should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt unease. The communication console chimed with incoming reports from the conquered Scriven territories. Vorath moved toward it, his crystalline form refracting the blue light of the command deck into rainbow patterns across the walls. He was old by Xanthari standards, his body showing the deep purple hue that came with age and wisdom. His military career spanned 2 centuries, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Admiral Communications Officer Thren reported, her younger, clearer crystal structure glowing with excitement. We are receiving status updates from all liberated worlds. Military casualties are minimal. Infrastructure damage is within acceptable parameters. We have achieved total victory. Casualties among the civilian populations? Vorath asked. Thren's glow dimmed slightly. That data is still being compiled. Initial reports indicate anomalies. Vorath moved closer. Explain anomalies. Before Thren could respond, Chief Scientist Nelith entered the command deck. Unlike most Xanthari, Nalit's crystalline structure was angular and sharp, reflecting her precise analytical mind. She carried a data tablet that pulsed with urgent red indicators. Admiral, we have a serious problem, Nelith said without preamble. I need you to see something immediately. Vorath followed her to the main display screen. Nelith activated footage from Karistan 4, one of the first worlds they had liberated from Scriven occupation. The image showed a medical facility filled with beings from various species, all lying perfectly still on beds. Their eyes were open. Their vital signs showed they were alive, but they were not moving. They were not responding. They simply stared at nothing. This is being reported across every world that experienced prolonged Scriven occupation, Neloth explained. Millions of individuals from dozens of species, all in the same condition. We are calling it the stillness. Vorath felt that unease deepen into genuine concern. A biological weapon? Poison? Neural toxin? We do not know, Neloth admitted, and those words carried weight. Neloth never admitted ignorance lightly. We have run every scan, every analysis. There is no poison, no virus, no bacterial infection, no neural damage that we can detect. Physically, these individuals are perfectly healthy, but mentally, they are gone. Not dead, but absent. Over the following days, the scope of the crisis became clear. Across 17 worlds, 8.3 million sentient beings had fallen into the stillness. They required constant care to stay alive, feeding tubes, waste management, prevention of muscle atrophy. They could breathe on their own, and their hearts beat normally, but they showed no awareness of their surroundings. No response to stimuli. No communication. Nothing. The Coalition's best medical minds converged on the problem. Xanthari physicians attempted crystalline resonance therapy to restart neural activity. Catharian healers used their legendary biomanipulation techniques. Varelian technicians tried direct neural interface to reach the trapped consciousness. Nothing worked. Every attempt either had no effect or, worse, caused the patients to deteriorate further. Vorath attended the emergency medical conference 3 weeks after the war's end. The Grand Hall on Xanthar Prime was filled with the greatest scientific minds in Coalition space. Yet the mood was one of defeat. We are missing something fundamental, Neloth said, addressing the assembly. This is not random neural failure. Every patient entered the stillness at the exact moment the Scriven forces abandoned their world. Synchronized across billions of kilometers? This was deliberate. A weapon, someone said. Obviously a weapon, Neloth snapped, her crystalline structure flashing with frustration. But what kind? How does it work? And most importantly, how do we reverse it? Dr. Kelman, a Catherian biologist, raised a tentacle. Perhaps we are approaching this incorrectly. We treat the body. But what if the damage is not physical? What if the Scriven found a way to attack consciousness itself? The room fell silent. Consciousness was the great mystery of the universe. Every species experienced it differently. The Xanthari processed thought through crystalline matrices. The Catherians through distributed neural networks in their tentacles. The Varelians through quantum-entangled brain structures. But consciousness itself, that indefinable quality of awareness, of self, remained beyond full scientific understanding. If that is true, Vorath said slowly, then we need expertise we do not possess. Where would we find such expertise? Dr. Kelman asked. We have already consulted every major civilization in coalition space. Nalat's structure suddenly glowed brighter. Not every civilization. There is one species we have not asked. Who? Vorath demanded. The humans. The reaction in the room was immediate and divided. Some scientists made sounds of dismissal. Humans had joined the coalition only 8 years ago. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards. Their understanding of physics was elementary. They had barely mastered faster than light travel. What could they possibly offer? But others remembered something else about humans. They were strange. They thought differently than any other species in the coalition. They had concepts that did not translate well into other languages. They wrote extensively about consciousness, about the nature of self, about things they called philosophy and psychology that seemed to exist in a space between science and art. The humans studied consciousness obsessively, Nalath continued. Not from a purely scientific perspective like we do, but from an experiential one. They have entire fields dedicated to understanding how consciousness experiences suffering and how to heal it. They call it mental health, psychiatry, therapy. These are concepts unique to their civilization. Because they are mentally unstable as a species, someone muttered. Or because they have learned to navigate mental instability in ways we never needed to, Nalath countered. Xanthari do not experience psychological trauma the way humans describe it. Neither do Catherians or Varelians. We have never needed to develop these fields of study because our consciousness operates differently. But if the stillness is an attack on consciousness itself, then perhaps we need someone who understands consciousness from the inside, as an experience rather than a system. Vorath considered this carefully. Pride told him to refuse. Logic told him to consider all options. Desperation told him they had no other choice. Send the request to Earth, Vorath ordered. Ask for their best expert in consciousness, trauma, and mental healing. Make it clear this is not a request for technology, but for understanding. The message traveled through the quantum communication network, reaching Earth Command within hours. The response came back in 2 days. They were sending Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in epidemiology and psychological trauma with experience in mass casualty mental health crises. When Dr. Chen's transport docked at Xanthar Prime Medical Station, Vorath went personally to meet her. He was curious about what kind of human the Earth government would send to address a problem that had defeated the Coalition's greatest minds. The airlock opened, and Dr. Sarah Chen stepped through. She was small even by human standards, perhaps 1.6 meters tall. She wore practical clothing, dark pants, a simple shirt, a jacket with many pockets. Her black hair was pulled back in a functional style. She carried a single bag over her shoulder and a data pad in her hand. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and very tired. Admiral Vorath, she said, bowing slightly in the human gesture of respect. Thank you for requesting Earth's assistance. I understand the situation is dire. Vorath studied her. She looked exhausted, but her voice was steady and professional. Dr. Chen, I will be honest with you. Many in the Coalition believe this request was a waste of time. They do not think humans have anything to offer that we have not already tried. Sarah smiled slightly, and Vorath saw something in that expression that surprised him. Not offense or defensiveness, but understanding, and perhaps a hint of dark humor. I am used to being underestimated, Admiral, she said. In my work on Earth, I specialized in treating conditions that other doctors said were impossible to cure. I worked with soldiers who came back from war unable to function. I worked with civilians who survived atrocities that broke something fundamental in them. I worked with people who others had given up on. Sometimes being underestimated is an advantage. People do not get in your way. Voreth found himself liking this small, tired human. Come, I will show you the patients. Then you can tell me if you can help, or if we are truly wasting time. They walked through the medical facility. Sarah asked questions constantly. Not about technology or biology, but about behavior. What were the patients doing when the stillness took them? What had they experienced under Scriven occupation? How long had they been exposed? What was their emotional state before the collapse? Finally, they reached Observation Room 7. Through the transparent wall, they could see 50 beings from various species. All lying motionless, all staring at nothing. Sarah stood at the window for a long time just watching. Her expression was serious, focused, but not surprised or confused. She looked like someone who recognized something familiar. "Admiral," she said finally, "has anyone considered that the stillness might not be a malfunction at all?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if it is not something broken that needs to be fixed? What if it is a defense mechanism? What if these people withdrew into themselves on purpose?" Voreth's crystalline structure pulsed with confusion. Why would anyone choose this? Sarah turned to look at him, and her expression was sad. Because sometimes, Admiral, the only way to survive something unbearable is to stop being present for it. We call it dissociation on Earth. When reality becomes too terrible to experience, consciousness protects itself by disconnecting. The body stays alive, but the self goes somewhere else, somewhere safe, even if that somewhere is nowhere. That sounds like a theory, Voreth said carefully. Sarah agreed. But I have seen something like this before. Never on this scale, never affecting this many people, but the pattern is familiar. These people experienced something under Scriven occupation that their consciousness could not process. Something so terrible that their minds chose absence over presence. And now they are trapped in that absence because they do not know how to come back. Or perhaps because they are afraid to come back. How do we help them? Sarah looked back at the patients. First, I need to understand what the Scriven did to them. Not physically, but psychologically. What did these people experience? What were they exposed to? Can you get me access to records, testimonies, any information about what life was like under Scriven occupation? Of course, Voreth said. But why does that matter? The Scriven are defeated. The threat is gone. The threat being gone does not mean the fear is gone, Admiral, Sarah said quietly. These people need to know they are safe. More than that, they need to believe they are safe. They need permission to come back. And to give them that, I need to understand what they are hiding from. Voreth arranged for Sarah to have access to everything. Over the next 3 days, she barely slept. She reviewed thousands of hours of testimony from survivors, studied Scriven occupation patterns, analyzed the psychological profiles of the stillness. Victims, what she found disturbed her deeply. The Scriven had not physically tortured their captives. They had done something far more insidious. They had subjected entire populations to what Sarah recognized as systematic psychological warfare. Constant exposure to disturbing imagery, broadcasts of nihilistic philosophy, forced observation of disturbing scenarios designed to break the spirit rather than the body. The Scriven had attacked meaning itself, trying to make their captives believe that existence was inherently worthless. That consciousness was suffering, that awareness itself was the enemy. Sarah sat in her temporary quarters, staring at her datapad, feeling sick. She had seen versions of this on Earth. Cults that used similar techniques. Totalitarian regimes that broke people psychologically. Propaganda designed to induce despair rather than compliance. But never on this scale. Never affecting millions across multiple worlds. She sent a message to Admiral Voreth. I need to speak with you immediately. I understand what happened, and I think I know how to help. The human APP roast, the conference room was packed with coalition medical staff when Sarah presented her findings. Admiral Voreth, sat at the head of the table. Chief Scientist Naloth was to his right. 24 other physicians, psychologists, and medical specialists filled the remaining seats. All of them looked skeptical. Sarah stood at the front of the room with her datapad, looking at the sea of crystalline, tentacled, and otherwise alien faces staring at her. She took a breath and began. "The stillness is not a disease," she said. "It is not a biological weapon. It is not a neural toxin. It is a mimetic weapon, a virus of ideas, rather than molecules." Dr. Kelman raised a tentacle. "Mimetic weapon? Please explain." "A meme, in the original scientific sense, is a unit of cultural information that spreads from mind to mind," Sarah explained. "Ideas, beliefs, behaviors. Most memes are harmless, or even beneficial, but some memes can be weaponized. They can be designed to spread through a population and cause psychological harm. The Scriven created a mimetic weapon specifically designed to attack the will to remain conscious." She pulled up images on the main display. During their occupation, the Scriven subjected populations to constant exposure to what I call existential propaganda. Messages designed to make consciousness itself seem unbearable. They broadcast scenarios that emphasize the meaninglessness of existence, the inevitability of suffering, the futility of hope. They created what psychologists call learned helplessness on a massive scale. "But why would that cause the stillness?" Naloth asked. "Because," Sarah said, "when consciousness becomes associated with unbearable suffering, the mind has a defense mechanism. It can dissociate, separate awareness from experience. In extreme cases, it can create what we call catatonia, a state where the body continues functioning, but conscious awareness withdraws completely. The stillness is mass catatonia, triggered by mimetic exposure." The room was silent. Then someone said, "That sounds like speculation, not science." Sarah nodded. "You are right. It is a hypothesis based on pattern recognition and my experience with similar conditions. But I can test it. Give me access to one patient. Let me try an intervention. If I am wrong, we will know quickly. If I am right, we might finally be able to help these people." Borth considered this. "What kind of intervention?" "I want to try something we call cognitive behavioral therapy combined with safe environment exposure," Sarah explained. "Essentially, I need to communicate with the patient's withdrawn consciousness and convince it that it is safe to return, that awareness is not unbearable, that consciousness is not the enemy." "How do you communicate with someone in complete catatonia?" Dr. Kelman asked. "Carefully," Sarah said, "and with tools that humans have developed over centuries of dealing with severe psychological trauma." After extensive debate, they agreed to let her try. The patient was named Kelris, a young Catherian male who had been in the stillness for 4 weeks. He lay on the medical bed, his tentacles motionless, his 3 eyes open but unseeing. Monitors showed healthy vital signs but zero cognitive response. Sarah sat beside the bed and began her work. First, she dimmed the harsh medical lighting, creating a softer environment. She asked the medical staff to reduce noise and activity around Kelris. Then she simply sat with him, speaking in a calm, quiet voice. "Kelris, my name is Sarah. I am a doctor from Earth. I do not know if you can hear me, but I am going to talk to you anyway. I know you have been through something terrible. I know that right now being aware feels dangerous or painful. I understand why you have withdrawn. It makes perfect sense." The monitor showed no change. Sarah continued. "But I want you to know something, Kelris. The Scriven are gone. The occupation is over. The terrible things they made you experience are finished. You are in a medical facility on Zenther Prime. You are safe now. Your body is healthy. The people here want to help you." She paused, then continued in the same calm tone. "I know that might be hard to believe. When you have been hurt badly enough, safety can feel like a lie. But I promise you, it is not a lie. Take your time. There is no rush. When you are ready, when you feel safe enough, you can come back. You can open your eyes, really open them, not just have them open. You can feel your tentacles. You can remember who you are, but only when you are ready." Sarah spent 6 hours with Kelris that first day, just talking, creating what she called a narrative of safety. The other doctors watched with obvious skepticism. "She is just talking," one physician said to Naloth. "How can words heal a consciousness that has withdrawn completely?" "I do not know," Naloth admitted. "But let us see what happens." On the second day, Sarah continued. She talked about small, concrete things. The temperature of the room, the softness of the bed, the sound of her voice. She talked about Earth, about oceans and forests, about things that had nothing to do with fear or suffering. She was building what she called a cognitive bridge-safe pathway back to consciousness. On the third day, something changed. Kelris's tentacles twitched. Just once, barely visible, but it was movement. Voluntary movement. The first since the stillness had taken him. Sarah saw it and smiled. "Good, Kelris. That is very good. You are still there. You can still move. You are safe enough to try moving. Take your time. There is no pressure. Just know that you can." By the end of the third day, Kelris was moving his tentacles regularly. Small movements, exploratory, as if he was relearning what his own body felt like. His eyes began to track movement in the room. He was coming back. On the fourth day, Kelris spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. "Safe." Sarah leaned forward, tears in her eyes. "Yes, Kelris, you are safe. Completely safe. The Scriven are gone. You survived. You can come back now." Scared Kelris whispered. "I know," Sarah said gently. "Being conscious can be scary after what you experienced. But you do not have to be conscious of everything all at once. We can do this slowly. You can come back piece by piece at your own pace. I will be here with you. So will the other doctors. We will help you." By the end of the week, Kelris was fully conscious. Exhausted, traumatized, but aware. He could communicate, eat, remember who he was. The first person to emerge from the stillness. The breakthrough sent shockwaves through the medical community. Sarah immediately began training sessions with coalition medical staff, teaching them the techniques that humans had developed over centuries. "You need to understand something fundamental," she told the assembled doctors. "Physical healing and psychological healing operate on different principles. When you fix a broken bone, you apply technology, and the body heals according to biological processes. But consciousness does not heal like bone. It heals through narrative, through meaning-making, through the reconstruction of a sense of self and safety." She taught them about trauma-informed care, about the difference between curing and healing, about how consciousness needed different things than bodies needed. "On Earth, we spent thousands of years figuring this out," Sarah explained. "We made terrible mistakes. We locked mentally ill people away. We performed barbaric treatments. We denied that psychological suffering was real. But eventually we learned. We developed entire fields of study dedicated to understanding and healing consciousness. Not because we are better than you, but because our species apparently experiences psychological trauma more intensely than yours do. We needed these tools to survive ourselves." The training was intense. Many coalition doctors struggled with concepts that seemed imprecise compared to their usual scientific methods. How could talking heal someone? How could narrative matter more than neural chemistry? How could belief affect biology? But Sarah was patient. She showed them case studies from Earth. She demonstrated techniques. Most importantly, she let them see results. As more coalition doctors learned her methods, more patients began emerging from the stillness. Dr. Kelman became one of Sarah's most dedicated students. "This is remarkable," the Catherian doctor said after successfully helping a third patient return to consciousness. "We were treating the symptom, the withdrawal, rather than the cause, which was the association between consciousness and suffering. By creating safety and rebuilding positive associations, we allow consciousness to return naturally." "Exactly," Sarah said. "You cannot force healing. You can only create conditions where healing becomes possible." But not everything went smoothly. A Xanthari patient named Varelis resisted all attempts at treatment. Sarah spent days trying to reach him with no response. Finally, she consulted with Naloth about Zenthari psychology. Zenthari process information through crystalline resonance, Naloth explained. We experience thought as vibration and pattern. Your narrative approach might not translate well to his consciousness structure. Sarah thought about this. Can you teach me about Zenthari resonance? Maybe I can adapt the therapy. Naloth was surprised. You would modify your entire approach for a single patient. Of course, Sarah said, there is no single correct way to heal. Each consciousness is unique. Effective therapy requires adapting to the patient, not forcing the patient to adapt to the therapy. Sarah and Naloth developed a modified approach that used harmonic resonance combined with narrative safety. They created vibration patterns that represented concepts like safety, hope, and return. When they tried this with Vorilus, his crystalline structure began to resonate in response. Within 2 days, he was conscious again. Word of the successes spread rapidly. Within 3 weeks, recovery rates were climbing dramatically. Thousands of patients were emerging from the stillness. The protocols Sarah had developed were being implemented across all 17 affected worlds. But Sarah noticed something troubling in the recovered patients' testimonies. They all reported similar experiences during their catatonia. They had been aware but unable to respond, and they had experienced something else, a presence in their withdrawn state. A feeling of vast, overwhelming fear that was not their own. Sarah brought this to Admiral Voreth's attention. The patients are reporting that during the stillness they experienced foreign emotions, specifically terror. Overwhelming, paralyzing terror that did not belong to them. The Skravan Vorath said, perhaps residual effects of the mimetic weapon. Maybe, Sarah said slowly. Or maybe the mimetic weapon was not just propaganda. Maybe it was more direct than that. Admiral, I need to know more about the Skravan, not their military capabilities, their psychology. Why would they create a weapon designed to make consciousness unbearable? Voreth was quiet for a moment. The Skravan were always enigmatic. They appeared 50 years ago from the dark regions beyond mapped space. They attacked without communication, without demands, without explanation. We assumed they were simply a hostile species seeking conquest. But what if they were not? Sarah asked. What if they had a reason? What if they were trying to communicate something? Through a weapon that traumatized millions? Through a weapon that made others feel what they were feeling? Sarah corrected. Admiral, I think we need to investigate Skravan psychology. Because if my hypothesis is correct, the stillness was not just an attack. It was a message. And we need to understand what that message was. Vorath authorized the investigation. Sarah worked with coalition xenologists to analyze every piece of Skravan data they had collected. Communication attempts, behavioral patterns, the few interrogations of Skravan, prisoners conducted before the final battle. What she found changed everything. Skravan were not evil. They were terrified. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The Skravan horde was fleeing from something. Something in the dark regions of space had driven them into coalition territory. Something that terrified them so completely that it had broken their civilization. And the stillness was not a weapon designed to conquer. It was a desperate attempt to communicate that terror. To make other species understand what the Skravan were experiencing, to share their fear in the only way their psychology knew how. Sarah stared at the compiled data with horror and sadness. They were not trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to make someone understand. They were screaming for help in the only language their trauma left them. But they killed thousands in their attacks, Naloth said. Yes, Sarah said quietly. Terrified, traumatized beings do terrible things. That does not excuse it, but it explains it. And more importantly, it means there is something out there, in dark space, that can cause this level of psychological damage to an entire species. Something that made the Skravan so desperate that they attacked the coalition just to make someone feel their fear. Admiral, we destroyed the Skravan completely. Every last one. We eliminated the threat. But we also eliminated the only beings who knew what was out there. The only beings who might have been able to tell us what we need to prepare for. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They had won the war. They had saved millions from the stillness, but they had also destroyed the only source of information about a threat they did not yet understand. The greater irrelevant TO in the Coalition Council chamber on Zenther Prime had never been so tense. Representatives from 40 species sat in the circular hall, all focused on the presentation that Admiral Voreth and Dr. Sarah Chen were delivering. The information about the Skreven's true nature had sent shockwaves through the entire coalition. "Let me be clear about what we are proposing," Voreth said, his crystalline structure pulsing with controlled intensity. "We destroyed the Skreven horde, believing they were mindless aggressors. Dr. Chen's investigation suggests they were refugees fleeing from something that traumatized their entire species. The stillness was not an attack weapon. It was a distress signal we did not understand." Varelian counselor stood, her quantum-entangled brain structure flickering with agitation. "With respect, Admiral, this changes nothing. The Skreven killed thousands of our people. They occupied our worlds. Whether they were acting from malice or fear is irrelevant. They were a threat, and we neutralized that threat. We did what was necessary." Sarah stepped forward. "Counselor, I understand your position. On Earth, we have a saying, hurt people hurt people. It means that those who have been traumatized often inflict trauma on others, not from evil, but from broken psychology. This does not excuse their actions. But it does mean we should examine why they acted as they did, because understanding the cause helps us prevent future tragedies. The Skreven are extinct," another counselor said. "What does it matter now, why they attacked?" "It matters," Sarah said firmly, "because they came from somewhere. They were fleeing from something, and that something is still out there. We need to understand what kind of threat can psychologically break an entire civilization so completely that they would rather attack another civilization than face it." She pulled up astronomical data on the main display. Analysis of Skreven ship trajectories before first contact shows they came from a region we call the Voida, dark sector with few stars and no habitable systems that we know of. Something in that region drove them out. Something that affects consciousness rather than bodies. And we just destroyed the only beings who understood what that threat was. Naloth stood to support Sarah's presentation. "I have analyzed the mimetic structure of the stillness in detail. It is extraordinarily sophisticated. The Skreven did not create this weapon through technology. They created it through direct psychological experience. The stillness is literally a transmission of the Skreven's own trauma, converted into a form that other species could experience. They were trying to make us understand what they were feeling. A species-wide scream for help," Sarah added quietly, "that we interpreted as an attack." The chamber erupted in debate. Some counselors insisted that the coalition had acted correctly, regardless of the Skreven's motivations. Others were disturbed by the revelation that they might have destroyed a victim species. All of them were concerned about what might exist in the void. High Counselor Thrain, ancient Zenthari whose deep purple structure indicated centuries of experience, finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of authority. "This council must address 3 questions. First, did we act incorrectly in defending ourselves against the Skreven? Second, do we have an obligation to investigate the threat they were fleeing? Third, what protocols should we establish to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future?" The debate continued for hours. Finally, consensus emerged on several points. The coalition had been correct to defend itself against Skreven aggression. But they should have attempted to understand the cause of that aggression earlier. An expedition would be sent to the void to investigate the threat. And most significantly, new first contact protocols would be developed that included psychological assessment alongside military analysis. "We also need something else," Sarah said during a break in the proceedings. She was speaking privately with Voreth, Naloth, and High Counselor Thrain. "The coalition needs a permanent organization dedicated to psychological crisis intervention on a civilizational scale. You need what humans would call the Galactic Mental Health Initiative," explained Thrain said. Sarah organized her thoughts carefully. Every species in the coalition has advanced medical technology. You can cure diseases, repair injuries, extend lifespans far beyond natural limits. But consciousness is not just biology. It is experience, narrative, meaning. When consciousness suffers, when entire civilizations experience trauma, you need different tools than what physical medicine provides, she continued. The Scriven Horde was a civilization in psychological crisis. If the Coalition had recognized that, if you had had protocols for addressing collective trauma, maybe first contact could have gone differently. Maybe you could have offered help instead of seeing only a threat. You propose we should have negotiated with beings who were actively attacking us? Vorth asked skeptically. I propose you should have asked why they were attacking, Sarah corrected. Not just strategically, but psychologically. What drives an entire species to aggressive behavior? What are they experiencing? What do they need? These are questions that military analysis alone cannot answer. Nalith's structure glowed with interest. You are suggesting we need specialists who can assess the psychological state of entire civilizations. Experts who can recognize when aggression stems from trauma rather than malice. Exactly, Sarah said. And more than that. The Coalition needs resources for helping civilizations in psychological crises before that crisis turns violent. Preventive intervention. Support systems. The tools that humans developed to address mental health, but applied on a galactic scale. High Counselor Thrain considered this for a long moment. Dr. Chen, such an organization would require expertise the Coalition currently lacks. Our species simply do not think about consciousness the way humans do. We would need human involvement to establish something like this. Earth would be honored to help, Sarah said. This could be humanity's contribution to the Coalition. Not military strength or advanced technology, but understanding of consciousness and psychological resilience. The proposal was brought before the full council. After extensive debate and modification, the Galactic Consciousness Initiative was approved. It would operate alongside traditional Coalition medical services, focusing specifically on psychological well-being at individual, cultural, and civilizational scales. Dr. Sarah Chen was named as the founding director, with a mandate to recruit specialists from Earth and train as Coalition personnel in human psychological methodologies. But there was still the matter of the Void Expedition. Probes sent to the region had returned with disturbing data. There was something there. Not a species or a fleet, but a phenomenon. An area of space where consciousness itself seemed to become unstable. Ships that traveled too deep into the void reported psychological disturbances among crew members. Sensors detected anomalies that affected neural activity across multiple species. It is a consciousness hazard, Naloth reported to the Expedition Planning Committee. Something in that region of space interacts with neural activity in ways we do not understand. The Scriven must have encountered this phenomenon, and it broke them psychologically. They fled into Coalition space not to escape something that was chasing them, but to escape something that was happening to them in that region. Sarah reviewed the probe data with growing concern. This is beyond anything we have dealt with on Earth. Environmental hazards that affect consciousness rather than bodies. We have concepts like infrasound that can cause anxiety or electromagnetic fields that affect brain function. But this is orders of magnitude more severe. Can we defend against it? Vorth asked. I do not know, Sarah admitted. But we need to understand it. If the void can break an entire civilization psychologically, it is a threat to every species in the Coalition. We cannot just avoid that region of space forever. The Void Expedition was planned with unprecedented caution. A small, heavily shielded ship with a volunteer crew from multiple species. Sarah insisted on joining the mission personally, along with a team of human psychologists and Coalition neuroscientists. They would approach the phenomenon slowly, with constant monitoring of crew mental states and protocols for immediate retreat if psychological disturbances began. 3 months after the stillness crisis ended, the expedition ship Consciousness Explorer departed for the void. The journey took 2 weeks through increasingly dark space. As they approached the region where Scriven trajectories originated, crew members began reporting unsettling dreams. Nothing severe, but enough to activate the monitoring protocols. Describe the dreams, Sarah asked a Catharian crew member during a psychological assessment. Falling, the crew member said, or maybe dissolving. It is hard to explain. Like my sense of self is becoming undefined. Like I am losing the boundaries that make me me. Sarah documented this carefully. Ego dissolution. loss of self-boundary. This is consistent with certain altered consciousness states humans experience, usually temporary and not harmful if properly supported, but disturbing nonetheless. As they penetrated deeper into the void, the effects intensified. Crew members across all species reported similar experiences: a sense of vastness, a feeling that consciousness was expanding beyond individual boundaries. Some found it terrifying. Others found it strangely peaceful, but all agreed it was fundamentally disorienting. Naloth monitored the sensor data. There is something here, not matter or energy as we traditionally understand it. The sensors are detecting quantum fluctuations that seem to interact specifically with organized information systems, specifically with consciousness. Sarah had a sudden insight. It is not attacking consciousness. It is amplifying it, making beings aware of consciousness itself as a phenomenon, rather than just experiencing consciousness naturally. That is why it is so disturbing. Imagine suddenly being aware of your own awareness, conscious of consciousness. It creates a recursive loop that can be psychologically destabilizing. The Scriven spent extended time in this region, Voreth said. If they experienced this constantly, it would explain their psychological breakdown. Being constantly aware of your own awareness, unable to simply exist naturally, that would be maddening. Sarah nodded slowly, and when they fled to Coalition space, they carried that trauma with them. The stillness was their attempt to make other beings understand what they had experienced, to share the horror of being trapped in recursive consciousness. The expedition carefully documented the phenomenon. It was not malicious. It was not even alive. It was simply a region of space where the quantum properties that supported consciousness became unstable. The effect was similar to how certain Earth environments affected human psychology: high altitudes causing confusion, isolation causing psychological disturbances. But vastly more severe? Can we shield against it? Naloth asked. Sarah considered this. Maybe if we understand the mechanism better, we might be able to develop psychological training that helps consciousness maintain stability even under these conditions. Meditation techniques, grounding exercises, cognitive frameworks that prevent the recursive loops. It would be like training astronauts to handle zero gravity, but for consciousness. They returned from the void with critical data. The threat was real, but understandable. Not an enemy to fight, but a hazard to navigate. The Coalition established exclusion zones around the affected region and began research into consciousness stabilization techniques. But the expedition had one more revelation. Deep in the void, they had detected signals. Faint, distorted, but identifiable as Scriven. Not from living Scriven. They were extinct. But from recorded messages, automated beacons, data storage that the Scriven had left behind before their civilization collapsed. The Coalition linguistics team worked for weeks to decode the messages. When they finally succeeded, what they found was heartbreaking. The messages were logs from Scriven scientists, desperately trying to understand what was happening to their people. Pleas for help, sent to any species that might receive them. And finally, warnings. Warnings about the void, about what it could do to consciousness, about the need to avoid that region. They tried to warn us, Sarah said, reading the translated messages with tears in her eyes. Before they attacked, before everything fell apart, they sent warnings. But we never received them, or if we did not understand them. And by the time we encountered the Scriven directly, they were too broken to communicate clearly. Admiral Varath stood in the linguistics lab reading the ancient warnings. His crystalline structure seemed to dim with something like grief. We could have helped them. If we had understood, if we had recognized their aggression as a symptom of severe psychological trauma rather than simple hostility, we could have helped them, maybe Sarah said gently. Or maybe they were too far gone by the time they reached Coalition space. Severe trauma can be irreversible, Admiral. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, healing is not possible. But we can honor them by learning from what happened, by being better prepared next time. The council held a memorial service for the Scriven species. It was unprecedented, honoring former enemies. But it felt necessary. The Scriven had not been evil. They had been victims who, in their trauma, had victimized others. Recognizing that complexity was important, Sarah stood before the memorial, alongside representatives from every coalition species. She had been asked to speak, to provide the human perspective on what had been learned. On Earth, she began, we have a concept called compassion fatigue. It is what happens when those who help others carry too much suffering for too long. Healers, counselors, emergency responders, they sometimes break under the weight of others' pain. The Scriven experienced something similar, but far worse. They encountered a phenomenon that made consciousness itself painful, and they had no one to help them process that pain. So they broke. And in breaking, they hurt others. She paused, looking at the assembled species. We cannot bring them back. We cannot undo what happened. But we can choose what we learn from this. We can choose to see suffering even in our enemies and respond with understanding alongside strength. We can build the systems and knowledge that might prevent this from happening to another species. The memorial was followed by action. The Galactic Consciousness Initiative became fully operational, with regional offices across Coalition space. Teams of human psychologists worked alongside Coalition medical personnel, developing new protocols for identifying and addressing civilizational-scale psychological crises. The initiative's first major success came 6 months later. A species called the Torvathi were experiencing collective psychological disturbances following a natural disaster that had destroyed their primary world. Traditional coalition relief had provided physical resources, shelter, food, medical care, but the Torvathi were deteriorating mentally, showing early signs of collective trauma that could potentially lead to aggressive behavior. The initiative intervened early, providing psychological support alongside material aid. Human counselors worked with Torvathi survivors, helping them process grief and trauma. Coalition psychologists provided community-building resources and meaning-making frameworks. Within months, the Torvathi were recovering psychologically as well as physically. This is what we should have done for the Scriven, Vorath said, observing the Torvathi recovery efforts. He had become a strong supporter of the initiative, seeing it as atonement for what the Coalition had failed to do. Sarah, standing beside him, nodded. Yes, but we can't change the past, Admiral. We can only use it to build a better future. A year after the stillness crisis, Sarah stood in her office on the initiative's headquarters station. The walls were covered with data displays showing psychological wellness metrics from across Coalition space. Recovery rates from the stillness had reached 94%. The remaining 6% were still in treatment, but making progress. New protocols for first contact psychological assessment were being implemented fleet-wide. And perhaps most importantly, the Coalition was learning to see consciousness as something that needed care and protection, not just as a byproduct of physical health. Her communication console chimed. It was Admiral Vorath. Dr. Chen, we have a situation that requires the initiative's expertise. A species in Sector 7 is experiencing what appears to be collective anxiety disorder. Following contact with one of our exploration vessels, they are not hostile yet, but their psychological state is deteriorating. We need someone who can assess and address this before it becomes a crisis. Sarah smiled. This was what she had hoped for: prevention rather than response. Intervention before tragedy rather than cleanup after. Send me the details, Admiral. My team will be ready to deploy within the hour. As she prepared for the mission, Sarah thought about how far they had come. The Coalition had learned that consciousness was not just something to study, but something to care for. That psychological wellness was as crucial as physical health. That understanding suffering, even in enemies, was not weakness, but wisdom. Humanity's contribution to the galactic community was not advanced weapons or superior technology. It was something simpler and more profound. The knowledge that consciousness could be hurt and healed. That trauma was real and treatable. That even in the darkness of space, mental health mattered. The war had ended on a Tuesday, but the real victory had come in the months that followed. When the Coalition learned to recognize psychological warfare, to treat consciousness trauma, and to see suffering beings as worthy of understanding rather than just elimination, Sarah looked out at the stars, thinking about the Scriven. About the millions who had been trapped in the stillness? About all the future beings who might be saved, because the coalition had finally learned to care for consciousness itself. "We remember you," she whispered to the memory of the lost Scriven civilization. "And we will do better because of what we learned from you." In the distance, a transport ship departed for Sector 7, carrying a team of consciousness specialists ready to prevent another tragedy. The initiative was working. The galaxy was learning. And humanity had found its place among the stars, not as warriors or conquerors, but as healers of minds, as caretakers of consciousness, as the species that understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness was simply knowing how to help someone suffering finally find light. The war was over. The real work had just begun.